So, this is our next lecture in our study of the American economy, and this is our last lecture looking at that first part of the of our economic study of the boom of the American economy. So, last week we really talked about the rise of consumerism that we see take place in the 1920s. This week we're really going to look at the rise of big business and the culture clash, or these kind of ways that people fought against all this change they were seeing in this one decade. The first thing you need to understand about the 1920s is that we see this shift. Remember, in the early 1900s and 19 teens, we see these progressives, these people fighting against these big businesses. We see a shift in the 1920s to where business becomes our friend. Politically, the 1920s were an era of Republican presidents. So the three major presidents were Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And these are the presidents that we see throughout the 1920s that represent and that showcase how politically we see this Republican era that business becomes our friend. This was really a result of kind of one key thing in this rejection of internationalism. So, rejection of internationalism means we don't want internationalism or dealing with other countries. This is because we were tired of death. Americans were tired of death for two reasons. Number one, this is after World War One. If you remember, World War One takes place from 1914 to 1918, so right at the end of the 19 teens. And people are tired of all the death and the atrocities from war. Also, in 1918 was a major flu epidemic. This spread throughout Europe and the United States. People blamed immigrants who were fleeing the war in Europe and coming to the United States for bringing the flu with them. In fact, the flu killed more people in the US than the war did. So, this is another reason why we reject internationalism. And the result was the Kellogg Briand Pact. This was a pact or an agreement that renounced war as an instrument of national policy. What that means is it was an international agreement not to use war as a way to solve problems. So countries agreed they would talk things out and not immediately go to war. The other way that we see a rejection of internationalism was through high tariffs. Okay, and so there's two key tariffs in the 1920s. Well, 1920s and 1930. The first is the Fordney-McCumber tariff, and it's listed at the bottom in your key terms for you. This was passed under President Harding in 1922. This raised the tariff on manufactured goods as high as 40%. So this nearly doubles the tariff. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. So if a product is made in another country, if they want to sell it here in the United States, they have to pay a tariff or a tax. And those tariffs go up and down. This way, the reason they do this is that way products that are made in other countries are actually more expensive, since the companies or the other countries have to charge more for a product here to cover the cost of the tariff. This protects US goods since US products are cheaper because they don't have to pay a tariff. So the Fordney-McCumber tariff is passed in 1922. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is passed in 1930. And this is just another example of a high tariff. This is the highest rates we see in history. The problem with this is that other countries retaliated. And so they raised tariffs on our products. So if we wanted to sell something in England, we were charging England a lot of money to sell their stuff here. So they charged us a bunch as well. And you can see in this graph here, so this is the 1920s, right? So we see this is actually the first one I mentioned, the Fordney-McCumber tariff. And then up here is the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So we see tariffs rising dramatically. The other thing we see, another reason why we see that business becomes our friend. So we see this rejection of internationalism. And then Americans are just exhausted by progressivism, right? They were fighting and fighting and fighting throughout the early 1900s and 19 teens, and Americans are exhausted. The presidents are choosing Supreme Court justices that are rejecting progressive reforms. The president gets to choose a judge whenever a judge retires or dies. We're in that place right now, right, in 2016. And the president gets to choose, and then the Senate has to confirm that appointment or approve it. But what we see in the 1920s is really these conservative judges placed. The other thing is that we see conservatives named to the cabinet. The cabinet is the group of presidential advisors. The president gets to decide who they are. And we see a lot of corruption during this time period. Number one, this picture on the right, President Harding was known to just kind of choose his buddies. They often called it the old boys club, right? So it was all his pals, all his friends, whether they were the best for the job or not. Under Harding, we see what's called the Teapot Dome scandal. And this is when the Secretary of the Interior is the dude that's in charge of all the land in the United States, right? The land inside the U.S. The Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, he actually leased Navy land, so land that was owned by the U.S. Navy. He leased it in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private oil companies. So he had no right to do that. He was essentially pocketing that money. Every time that these oil companies would pay their rent or their lease, Albert Fall put that in his own pocket. He was the first cabinet member to ever go to prison. So we see this example of corruption in the government during this time. The other thing that we see this call for is this return to normalcy. Okay, this idea that we're going to go back to what's normal. We're going to protect big business. And one of the ways that this was allowed is that businesses were allowed to police themselves. Okay, the government began to overlook violations. The government really wasn't looking after businesses anymore. They were tired of doing it. They also stopped programs to aid ordinary people. A program that came up was under Coolidge was the McNary-Haugen Bill, and the McNary-Haugen Bill was designed to help farmers. The idea was that the government would buy or would store any extra food that was made until prices went up, right? You guys looked last week at how bad things were in the 1920s for farmers, and so this was a way to help the farmers. But Coolidge, he vetoed or he rejected that idea. So this is just, again, the McNary-Haugen Bill. It doesn't become a law or an act. This is another example of the government protecting big business. Economically, we see big businesses growing to huge sizes that they hadn't been before. The business person is really seen as a hero, right? He becomes kind of there's a nickname called the captain of industry, right? That we talk about during the industrialization period. That's definitely the way that big business owners are seen during this time period. And this is because of the prosperity, right? People, because of the consumerism, that the idea that buying things is good. And remember, we talked about last week, the consumption ethic gets replaced instead of the production ethic, the people's value being on what they produce. People's value is based on what they consume. And so big business owners are seen as heroes. Another thing we see happen are mergers are just exploding. Remember, we talked about vertical or horizontal mergers. Whatever kind you're looking at, we see an increase in mergers or larger businesses growing, right? The Federal Trade Commission did nothing to stop this. In fact, in 1929, half of the nation's wealth was held by 200 of the largest corporations. So 50% of all money in the US was held by only 200 businesses. And you can see in the graph here, right, this increase throughout the 1920s. Here's 1920, it kind of drops, but after 1922, it just takes off. By 1929, we see a huge increase. The other thing we see happen with that is union membership is decreasing. So again, this is the power of big business, right? That the laborers aren't important anymore. The union members are not important, but the owners are important. That's because unions became associated with communism. If you remember, one of Karl Marx's key ideas was that workers around the world would unite. And so this idea is tied to workers uniting for better working conditions. This also has to do with the Red Scare during the 1920s. If you remember from world history, 1921 is when communists come to power under Vladimir Lenin in what becomes the Soviet Union, right? So this is a very scary time for people regarding the Red Scare. So because unions are associated with communism, we see the numbers of union members drop. But again, this is evidence of the government favoring big business. And just to remind you guys, we talked about this last week, so I'm going to go through this quickly. It's kind of just a review. But the other thing is we see the development of mass culture, right? We have the national market where the same goods are available across the country because of chain stores. Also, you have remember department stores with ready-made clothes, so people can buy the same clothes. Again, this idea of consumerism, that buying things is good for the economy. In the 1920s, we see the rise of mass media through magazines like Reader's Digest or Time magazine that all start in the early 20s. The New Yorker begins in 1925, so everyone is seeing and reading the same thing. Again, the radio, people have access to the news right away, so they know what's going on. Plus, again, they're hearing the same thing across the country, so people have something to talk about from one side of the country to the other. We talked about movies as well, right? Movies create culture. People are copying what they see from fashion to leisure time, right? What are you going to fill your leisure time with? Well, you see people doing things in the movie. Um, the movies are also kind of propaganda, right? They're showing traditional values, hard work and family, but they're also showing the new culture. These women, these flappers, the women with shorter hair and shorter dresses, as well as jazz music. Okay, jazz music is a major, we talked about during the Harlem Renaissance unit in the first semester, but this was a major, major part of the 1920s. All of this massive change, excuse me, and all of these, the business becoming our friend and large businesses taking off really lead to a culture clash. The reason why is people are feeling that the change is leaving them behind. There are so many new things in such a short period of time that people begin to cling or hold on to what was familiar. Not just the new inventions, but the new cultures that we see, right? So, some of the examples, the role of women drastically changes in the 1920s in just a 10-year period in this one decade, right? We have the rise of the flappers. They have shorter hair, shorter skirts, significantly less clothing in general than what we saw before this. And so this becomes this kind of clash between the people who support the old way and the people who are embracing the new culture. Not only that, but women's suffrage, right? This passes in 1920. Women earn the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. They begin to participate politically, which is a sphere that had really been kept out of their hands for a long time, right? And so for this is a drastic change for women in this decade. We also see women entering the workforce in the 1920s. Because there were so many jobs available, there are opportunities now for women that didn't exist before, particularly as secretaries and store clerks. Another culture clash is not just women, but also religious beliefs are challenged. One of the most common examples is what's called the Scopes Monkey Trial. And this was in Tennessee. A high school teacher named John Scopes, he breaks a law in Tennessee on purpose. The law said you cannot teach evolution in school. So this teacher went in, he taught evolution, and he gets arrested. The trial, again, he gets arrested on purpose. He's trying to challenge the law. The trial becomes just nationwide news. He ends up, newspapers and news reporters from all over the country show up to cover the trial. People even bring trained monkeys and have them kind of running around town. Ultimately, he was found guilty, but again, and he was ordered to pay a fine. So the court upheld the Tennessee law, right? They said no, you cannot teach evolution. He is guilty. But this really puts Darwin on trial and it challenges traditional religious beliefs. And this was a problem for people. The religion and kind of the dominant theory is being challenged. We see a lot of change. We also see prohibition during the 1950s. I'm sorry, 1920s. Prohibition was a ban on the manufacture, the sale, or the transportation of alcohol. You can't make it, you can't sell it, and you can't move it. Okay? The idea is that this would solve kind of the social ills or the social problems caused by alcohol, but it totally failed because it was difficult to enforce. You still had bootleggers or people who were making alcohol illegally. Plus, the 1920s, people have cars, so they can transport it in their own vehicle. They don't have to rely on somebody else. They don't have to rely on trains or businesses to transport their alcohol. Plus, the reality was everyone was breaking the law, from politicians to police officers to factory workers. So, a police officer is not going to enforce a law that they're breaking themselves. And you also have during this time period the rise of the mob, the mobsters, and the reason why they become so prominent during the 1920s is they're providing the alcohol and they're providing a place for people to go and drink this alcohol. Okay, and so, but again, this just represents a way people are fighting all this change, and so they feel like if they can eliminate alcohol, maybe that'll stop all this change. It doesn't work. We also see the rise of the Klan in the 1920s to numbers they'd never seen before. The targets are really different depending on the locale and where the Klan was, but ultimately they're resisting change, right? The 1920s, again, don't forget you have the Harlem Renaissance and the rise of African American culture is shifting, and they're making their own identity for themselves. So that's one piece of this. Plus, again, women getting the right to vote and being out in public more often, religion being challenged. The Klan really believed themselves to be the guardians of morality, the guardians of what was right and wrong. And so we see a huge increase in the 1920s in the number of people who are a part of the Klan. We also see these immigration restrictions. Remember, many immigrants are favoring limits toward other immigrants. Remember this kind of old versus new immigrants. These old immigrants are like, these new people coming in are lousy and they don't have what we have. Let's keep them out, right? And so we see quotas created. And we talked about this as a little bit at the beginning of the semester. In 1921, there was a quota where 3% of the immigrants were allowed to come in, but they used the number from the 1890 US Census. So only 3% of the immigrants who lived here in 1890 are allowed to come in the 1920s. In 1924, it was lowered even more to only 2%. And so this really favors Western Europeans. You can see kind of this graph here shows you this is North and West Europe, this is South and East Europe, and this is a place of origin for the American immigrant population in 1920. 30 years earlier in 1890, this section of the graph would have been significantly bigger. So this is favoring Western Europe. We also see people doing things like, hey, let's put literacy tests against immigrants. So again, as a result of all this change of the 1920s, we see people kind of exhausted from progressivism and allowing big businesses to take over. We also see a bunch of social change and people responding negatively to that through this culture clash, right? Women's role is changing, religious beliefs are being challenged. People are thinking that if we eliminate alcohol, it'll solve all these social problems. The Klan is believing that they're protecting what is good and what is right in the US, and people are trying to limit immigrants. And also, people, the government in particular, are favoring big business during this time.